I am telling you tonight, with the full weight of 2 decades of operational analysis behind every word, that the scenario I am about to walk you through is not a theoretical exercise. It is not a war game abstraction constructed for the purposes of academic discussion. It is the precise operational logic that sits beneath a deployment posture that exists right now, in which 1,100 American ground forces are positioned within a geographic corridor where the conditions for catastrophic encirclement are not merely possible but are, under a specific and entirely plausible sequence of events, close to inevitable. Not because of the forces arrayed against them, not because of the terrain which is difficult but navigable, because of a strategic geometry that places those 1,200 soldiers inside a choke point that an adversary with patience, preparation, and the right triggering event could seal in under 40 minutes, and from which no extraction option that does not risk destroying the force it is attempting to retrieve currently exists in executable form. Let me tell you what that geometry means before we go any further. Because 1,200 is not a number to be processed alongside the other deployment figures that rotate through the news cycle every 72 hours. 1,200 soldiers in this specific corridor represents something qualitatively different from a forward presence. It represents a hostage architecture. A structure in which the soldiers themselves, by virtue of where they are and what surrounds them, become the most consequential bargaining instrument in the most consequential waterway on the planet. We are talking about officers whose combined operational experience represents an institutional knowledge base that cannot be reconstituted on any timeline relevant to the crisis their capture would produce. Non-commissioned officers who are the functional connective tissue between command intent and ground execution. Specialists whose individual skill sets and signals in logistics and combat medicine take years to develop and are not present in the reserve pipeline in sufficient depth to replace. The force projection capacity that those 1,200 individuals represent is not simply the sum of their weapons and their training. It is the accumulated institutional investment of the most expensive military apparatus in human history, positioned inside a trap whose architecture was not built overnight and is not going to be dismantled by the kind of reactive adjustment that crisis management typically produces. Tonight, I am going to take you through exactly how this scenario develops. I am going to explain the geographic and operational logic that makes the Strait of Hormuz corridor the most dangerous real estate on Earth for a ground force of this size under these conditions. I am going to walk you through the sequence by which a deployment framed as a deterrent posture becomes, through a specific chain of entirely foreseeable decisions, an encirclement situation that no amount of American air power can resolve without killing the people it is attempting to protect. I am going to explain what 1,200 living American prisoners would mean for every calculation in every capital city that depends on American deterrence to structure its security environment. And I'm going to tell you honestly whether the current posture reflects a considered assessment of those risks or something more institutional than that. The compounding momentum of planning processes that have already committed to an answer and are now building the intelligence picture to support it. Stay with me, because the picture that emerges from this analysis is not the picture that the briefing room is going to give you. And if this channel has been delivering that kind of honest analysis, hit subscribe right now and drop your read of this in the comments. I want to know whether you think the people making these deployment decisions have run this particular scenario to its conclusion. The first thing you need to understand about the Hormuz corridor as an operational environment is that it does not behave like any other theater in which American forces have operated in the last 30 years. I want to be precise about that distinction because it shapes everything that follows. The corridors in which American ground forces have historically operated, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Gulf, were environments in which American air superiority was not merely an advantage, but an operational assumption so foundational that it structured every aspect of ground force doctrine, from logistics to tactical movement to the decision calculus around acceptable risk. In the Hormuz corridor, that assumption does not hold in the same form. And a force whose doctrine was built on an assumption that does not hold is not a force that has been degraded. It is a force that has been architecturally disarmed before the first engagement occurs. The geography is not the danger. The danger is the interaction between the geography and the layered denial architecture that has been constructed within it over a period of years by an adversary that studied American operational patterns with the specific purpose of identifying the assumptions that American doctrine cannot function without and then systematically building the capability to remove them. What exists in the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz is not a conventional defensive perimeter. It is a three-dimensional denial environment combining coastal missile batteries positioned at depths and in configurations that degrade the targeting solutions American naval aviation depends on, Subsurface assets capable of operating within the acoustic clutter that the shallow water Hormuz approach generates in ways that negate the ASW methodologies that American forces have optimized for deep water environments, and an electronic warfare architecture specifically calibrated to the frequency ranges and waveforms that American close air support coordination uses to connect ground forces with the aircraft that keep them alive. That last element is the one that demands the most serious analytical attention. Because the force of 1-200 that is currently positioned in this corridor has not been stripped of its communications. It has not been jammed at the time of this recording. Its connections to the command structure above it, to the air assets that support it, to the logistics chain that sustains it, are functioning. The question that the official posture does not answer honestly is what happens to those connections in the first 12 minutes of an adversary decision to activate the denial architecture that has been built and tested and rehearsed for exactly the scenario of an American ground force attempting to operate in proximity to the strait. The answer, based on the capabilities that open source and technical analysis allows us to assess with reasonable confidence, is that the degradation is not gradual. It is not a slow erosion that gives commanders time to adapt and reroute and improvise. It is simultaneous, broadband, and specifically designed to sever the connections that American forces have been trained to treat as a given, not as a variable. The encirclement scenario does not begin with an assault on the force. That is the version that American doctrine is optimized to respond to, which is precisely why it is not the version that a sophisticated adversary would execute. The encirclement begins with the closing of the corridor behind the force. Engineering assets, pre-positioned along the two viable withdrawal routes that the terrain provides, capable of rendering both routes impassable within a window of 30 to 40 minutes. Simultaneously, the activation of the sea denial architecture in the approaches closes the naval extraction option that American operational planning defaults to when ground extraction becomes untenable. The force is not under direct assault. It is sealed. It is inside a box whose walls are not soldiers but geography and denial systems, and it discovers that the box has been closed around it at the moment when the communications architecture that would allow it to coordinate a response has already been degraded to the point where coordinated response is no longer the operational reality. By the time the situational picture assembles itself into something that American commanders, at the level of the force itself and at the level of the headquarters above it, can accurately describe, the conditions for a different outcome no longer exist. The force is surrounded, unsupported, and holding a negotiating position it did not intend to occupy. Now I want to address the intelligence dimension of this scenario directly, because it is the question that any honest postmortem would center on, and that the institutional processes involved in generating the current deployment posture have demonstrably failed to answer with the rigor the situation demands. The question is not whether American intelligence assessed the denial architecture in the Hormuz approaches correctly. The question is whether it assessed the intent, the adversary's willingness to activate that architecture against an American force, with the same fidelity that it assessed the capability. Because capability assessments and intent assessments are produced by different analytical processes, weighted by different institutional incentives, and subject to different categories of systematic error. Capability assessments are falsifiable. You can measure a radar signature, triangulate a missile battery, characterize a jamming waveform. The evidence either supports the assessment or it does not. Intent assessments are different. They are generated by frameworks that must make assumptions about how adversary leadership weighs costs and benefits, red lines, escalation thresholds, domestic political constraints, and the credibility of deterrent signals that American posture is designed to transmit. Those frameworks, in every military intelligence organization that has ever existed, are not neutral. They are shaped by the institutional needs of the planning process that consumes them. A planning process that has decided to maintain a forward ground presence in the Hormuz corridor needs an intent assessment that concludes the adversary will not move against that presence in a way that would make the presence untenable. The assessment that reaches commanders is therefore not the product of unconstrained analytical judgment about adversary intent. It is the product of analytical judgment operating inside an institutional framework that has already concluded what the assessment needs to say in order to support the decision that has already been made. This is not a failure of individual analysts. It is the structural condition of intelligence production inside any institution operating under operational and political pressure to project confidence and maintain commitment. And it is the kind of failure that does not correct itself from the inside. Let me now address what 1-200 living American prisoners would mean for the strategic picture, because I believe this is the dimension of this scenario that receives the least serious analytical attention in the public discussion. And that is, in my assessment, the most consequential element of the risk architecture the current posture has created. The 200 soldiers currently deployed in that corridor are not primarily a military instrument in the event of their capture. They become a political instrument of a precision and a power that no military option can match. And they become it immediately on the day the encirclement is completed, before a single negotiation has been opened, before a single official statement has been released. To understand why living American prisoners represent a strategic instrument of this particular order, you need to understand what captured American soldiers mean in the American political system in a way that is qualitatively different from the meaning of almost any other category of military loss. The United States does not leave its people behind. That is not a policy preference that administrations can set aside when the strategic calculation becomes inconvenient. It is a political commitment whose enforcement mechanism is the American public operating through the most direct instrument available in a democracy, the families. 1,200 families is not a manageable constituency. It is 1,200 direct lines of personal anguish connecting to 1,200 family networks, each of which has voices and media access and the absolute moral authority that comes from having a son or daughter or husband or wife held by an adversary whose demands the sitting administration has to either meet or publicly refuse to meet while those families watch. The leverage operates at 3 levels, and all 3 activate simultaneously on the day of capture. At the immediate level, every military option that American planners would reach for in a crisis involving American forces, airstrikes, naval interdiction, ground reinforcement, becomes a direct and unacceptable threat to the survival of the prisoners the moment the adversary distributes that population across a geographic and infrastructural space that American targeting cannot engage without killing the people it is attempting to retrieve. The operational freedom that American forces exercise in the region today does not exist in the same form after capture. That constraint is permanent for as long as the adversary chooses to maintain it. At the operational level, every diplomatic channel that activates in the crisis operates on terms the adversary sets, because the adversary holds the only outcome the American political system cannot publicly decline to pursue. The concessions that return 1,200 American prisoners are not concessions that any American administration can deliver without a domestic political cost that rivals the cost of not returning them. That collision between the irresistible pressure to bring them home and the impossible cost of the price for doing so is not a vulnerability the adversary stumbled into. It is the strategic objective that a sufficiently patient and sophisticated adversary would design an entire operational architecture to create. At the strategic level, 200 American prisoners in the Strait of Hormuz transforms the entire framework of American deterrence in the Gulf and beyond. Every partner and every competitor who has been calibrating their behavior against the assumption of American willingness to bear costs and project force now has a data point that revises that assumption in ways that no subsequent demonstration of American capability can fully reverse. Deterrence is not a capability. It is a belief. And the belief, once revised by a single high-visibility failure of the posture that was supposed to sustain it, does not restore itself on the timeline that American strategic interests require. The comparison that analysis of this scenario defaults to is Beirut, 1983, Khobar Towers, Black Hawk Down. And those comparisons are not wrong in the sense that all of them represent moments when an American forward presence encountered an operational environment whose actual character differed from the assessed one in ways that produced outcomes the presence was not designed to manage. But those comparisons obscure something critical about the scale and the strategic location of what a Hormuz encirclement represents. Beirut changed American deployment doctrine for a generation. A successful encirclement of 1,200 American soldiers at the most consequential maritime choke point on the planet, one through which 40% of globally traded seaborne oil transits, does not change deployment doctrine. It changes the architecture of American deterrence in every theater where that deterrence depends on adversary belief in American willingness to accept forward risk. Whether this scenario is preventable depends on whether the decisions being made right now about force posture, rules of engagement, extraction planning, and honest intelligence assessment of adversary intent reflect the scenario I have just described or reflect an institutional confidence that the deterrent signal the presence is supposed to transmit will prevent the adversary from ever testing whether that signal is backed by a credible military option. I assess that institutional confidence as the primary risk factor in the current posture, not the adversary's capability. The adversary's capability is known. The risk is the belief that capability without activated intent is the same thing as safety. It is not. It has never been. And the geographic and operational logic of the Hormuz corridor does not permit the margin of error that belief requires. Here is the question I want to leave you with. The posture that places 200 American soldiers inside that corridor was constructed on assumptions about deterrence, about adversary intent, and about the credibility of American extraction options that this analysis suggests are not as robust as the planning process that generated them required them to be. At what point does the honest acknowledgement of those gaps produce a decision to revise the posture? And who bears the political cost of making that acknowledgement before an event occurs versus the catastrophic strategic cost of failing to make it in time? From where I sit, applying the most honest analysis I am capable of to the operational picture in front of me, the answer to that question does not just determine the safety of 200 soldiers. It determines whether the strategic architecture that American power in the Gulf depends on survives the next crisis intact or becomes the next case study in what happens when institutional confidence outpaces honest threat assessment. Tell me what you think in the comments. Share this if the analysis delivered what the headlines could not. Subscribe for the analysis that follows the evidence wherever it leads.